Okay, so today's topic, alone during a pandemic. You know, all of us have been affected in one way or another by what's happened over the last 1.5 years. It's unprecedented, at least in our lifetime, for a pandemic to affect the whole world, and which has caused not only the death of many people, but also people have become isolated, locked down in many countries. Not in this country, but still we have restrictions. So, you know, when I talked before about the book of joy, one of the obstacles to joy is loneliness. And so in the book of joy, it talks about this. So I thought I would take up this topic. So first of all, I have some questions. So do you like to be alone? During this pandemic, maybe you've been alone more or forced to be alone. And secondly, what causes loneliness? Just because we have countries where people are locked down or restricted, do we feel lonelier? And what can we do to overcome loneliness, not only for ourselves, but for other people who may be experiencing it? And finally, has your life changed much during the pandemic? So these 4 questions I will return to at the end. So what is loneliness? According to researchers, loneliness is defined as feeling lonely more than once a week. It causes people to feel empty, alone, and unwanted. People who are lonely often crave human contact, but their state of mind makes it more difficult to form connections with other people. It can cause mental health problems such as anxiety, emotional distress, addictions, decreased sleep quality, depression, and even increase the risk of suicide. And I think through this pandemic, because people have been locked down, so I know in the United Kingdom, if there's in America, there's an increase in mental health problems, an increase in suicide and depression. So certainly the pandemic has created for people a sense of loneliness because life has changed so much and they're isolated. Researchers at the University of California found that loneliness is highest amongst people in their 20s and reached their lowest point among those in their 60s. So I'm in my 60s, so I'm in a pretty good group. If I look back to my 20s, I would say, yes, I felt more insecure. And you know, trying to find your identity and to try to find your purpose in life. But that's also interesting because we might think old people who live alone, who are isolated, are lonely, and that may be the case. But actually, it's more likely for young people who are lonely, either living alone or not. So how is it to live alone? We live in big cities where there's more loneliness. So which country do you think in the world is considered the loneliest country in the world? Well, guess what? According to Statistics Brain, the loneliest country in the world is Sweden. Almost half of the nation's population live alone, 47%. Although I would like to qualify this because this research, I mean, if you live alone, does it mean there is more loneliness? Because some people maybe they like to be alone. But obviously there is a correlation, there is a connection between being isolated, living your own place, and feeling more lonely because you're separated from people. A 2019 study found 59% of Swedes feel alone often or sometimes. And 24% of Swedes would like to have more friends. That's a quarter, that's a lot. And 1 in 10 say they don't have a single close friend. So we can say that in Sweden, actually Sweden, along with the other Nordic countries, is considered one of the top 10 happiest places to live. So that's a bit of a contradiction. So both people are happier here, maybe more secure, but at the same time, people feel more lonely. In fact, if you look at the top 10 countries in the world, most people, as I said, who live alone are in Sweden, followed closely by the United Kingdom and Japan and so on. So these are the top 10 countries where more people are living alone. And so we live in a city. This is New York City. How is it to live there? And Douglas Abrams, who wrote this book, The Book of Joy, he grew up in Manhattan. And this is what he says about his life growing up in a big city. I grew up in Manhattan, surrounded by 7 million New Yorkers. As a boy, I never really met the people who lived in our apartment floor. I would occasionally hear their doors close with an empty metallic clang and locks turned behind them. If we did see them while waiting for the elevator, few words were spoken and eyes were averted. So, I mean, if you walk along a street in Stockholm, I mean, people don't normally greet each other. I suppose in a smaller place they would. Or actually where I live, because there are a few people in our particular neighborhood, then if I see a person and walk towards them, I will normally greet them. But living in a city, people can feel more isolated. So you actually can feel lonely in a crowd, surrounded by many people. And whereas people who live in the countryside, or you could say more traditional countries, smaller communities, people would rely upon each other, would need each other. They wouldn't be alone because they are needed and they have the support. Whereas in a big city, you can feel alone because you don't, you feel isolated from your family members because you've moved away from your family, moved away from your friends. I think if you're a university student and, meeting new people, it takes time. And if I look back to when I trained as a student, I certainly felt lonely in the beginning and it just takes time. But when you're with many people, I remember sitting in a kind of the dining room in our university, not knowing anybody. And then you see a table of people who are sitting together and they're laughing and so on. And you can feel pretty isolated and lonely when you see others look happy and content and together with others. And when you feel, well, I don't have a friend. And also as a teacher, I could see over many years, you get some students, they already know each other when they come to the school. They've known each other since Dargis. And then others who are new, they feel isolated. And so it's difficult. It's a real problem. So how is it to be alone in this pandemic? What are people's experience? Well, first of all, here we are. All these people are wearing masks. That's very unusual. That's not something we normally do. And that in a sense, separates us because we can't see each other's faces. So we want a normal life. And a normal life is interacting with each other. But our normal life has been disrupted. In Britain, there've been several lockdowns. Schools are being closed. And so people, even in some countries, people are fined if they go out on the streets when they shouldn't be there. And there's been a natural separation of people. When you go to a supermarket, you have to keep 1.5 meters apart. So this social distancing is a new term really for this modern time we're living in. So when I go to a supermarket, I purposely avoid getting too close to people. And of course, there is this kind of plastic in front when you go to the cashier. There's the plastic there, so you can't spread their germs. And some of them are wearing masks. So this is unnatural. This is not how we're created to be. And then we're staying at home more to keep safe. So we stay away from people. But that's also not natural. And people have lost their jobs. Shops have closed, small businesses have closed, and then they lose their jobs. And if you lose your jobs, then you wonder, well, what do I do in my life? I feel isolated. And many people, they find meaning in the jobs they do. They get value from it. So that's taken away from them and they don't have it and they're stuck at home and they wonder what their purpose is. It can be very challenging. And so there are more mental health challenges during a pandemic because more people are home alone. more people are isolated. And but also, you know, if someone is in hospital, you actually can't visit them. Because I remember Kenzo, we went to visit Kenzo, but we couldn't actually go up to the ward. He had to be brought down, and we couldn't go into the hospital. So there's all these kinds of restrictions. And even have a doctor's appointment, maybe you have to have it online. You can't actually meet the person. So as I said earlier about how loneliness, it can lead to depression, anxiety, or even suicide. So it's not an easy time. And then, of course, the media constantly remind us about the number of deaths. And so that's why we shouldn't really watch too much of the news, because it can create fear, you know, fear. And I suppose that's underlying many of the lockdowns, fear that if we don't lock down, or we don't stay away from people, we don't wear a mask, then we could die, yeah? And even though the number of people out of the whole population in Sweden at the moment, only 0.02 of the population who have COVID-19 are in a serious or critical state. So it's still a very small percentage. But if it's on the media, in the newspapers every single day, it can make us feel afraid. And also we want to stay away from people. But actually, not everybody reacts with fear. Not everybody feels alone in a pandemic, because actually it's provided the opportunity for families to spend more time together. So, you know, my daughter Lisa and Phil, okay, they have a daughter called Ginny, and so Phil has had to work at home most of this time. So that's been very helpful to Lisa to have him around, and also it's been very good for Ginny to not just have the mother, but to have the father there as well. So I think in their particular situation, it's been very helpful. And I suppose it's given the opportunity all over the world, because people have to work from home, to be together more. And with the increasing use of the internet to communicate, actually, even though we can't meet personally, like today, we're able to communicate anyway because of modern technology. And in our worldwide movement, all of these, you know, conferences and kind of gatherings we've had, kind of, you know, we could bring people who don't need to travel, so it's much cheaper. So I think there's an opportunity for people to meet who wouldn't otherwise meet or would have to travel a long distance. And it's also given the opportunity to start a new hobby, such as knitting. And I think there was a survey done in England, and you know, people are doing more yoga, they're going cycling more, they are learning a musical instrument. So actually, if you're at home and you've lost your job, actually you have more time to invest in something interest you have, which you maybe didn't feel time to do before because you were stressed because of your job. So in one sense, you could argue that losing your job, having more time, is taking away the stress and enable you to focus on something creative. And it's time to slow down, to reflect on life. And so in a busy, you know, in the busy modern life, we often, you know, the word stress is not a word I was hearing all the time as a child. But as the years have gone by, it's like it's kind of, you're always hearing about it. And I know in my job as a teacher, it was a stressful job, never time to rest, always something new to do, never stops. But now it's a time to stop. And also I'm retired. So, and for many of us who are retired in our movement, well, this is a time not just to slow down, to reflect upon our life, to look back and to kind of think about, you know, where we're going. And actually, it's also a time to do something to benefit others. This man, he's called Captain Sir Tom Moore, and he just died this year. But actually, before he died, he did something remarkable. And I would like to tell you his story. So he was a British Army officer who raised money for charity in the run-up to his 100th birthday during the COVID-19 pandemic. He served in India and the Burma campaign during the Second World War, and later became an instructor in armored warfare. After the war, he worked as a managing director of a concrete company and was an avid motorcycle racer. So he already lived a very fulfilling and active life. But on the 6th of April, 2020, at the age of 99, he began to walk 100 lengths of his garden in aid of National Health charities, NHS charities together, with the goal of raising £1,000 by his 100th birthday. And in the 20-day course of his fundraising, he made many media appearances and became a popular household name in the UK, earning a number of accolades and attracting over 1.5 million individual donations. In recognition of his efforts, he received the BBC Sports Personality of the Year Helen Rollason Award at the 2020 ceremony. He performed in a cover version of the song "You'll Never Walk Alone," sung by Michael Ball, with proceeds going to the same charity. And the single topped the UK music charts, making him the oldest person to achieve a UK #1. On the morning of Moore's 100th birthday, the total raised by his walk passed £30 million. And by the time the campaign closed, at the end of that day, it had increased to £32.79 million, which is actually worth almost 39 million with expected tax rebates. His birthday was marked in a number of ways, including flypasts by the Royal Air Force and the British Army. And then he received over 150,000 cards and was appointed as an honorary colonel of the Army Foundation College. And on the 17th of July, 2020, he was personally knighted by the Queen at Windsor Castle. He died on February the 2nd, 2021, at Bedford Hospital, where he was taken after being treated for pneumonia and then testing positive for COVID-19. So, amazing, yes? You know, he was in that vulnerable group like I am, older people. But what he did with his life, the last year of his life, during a pandemic, rather than just isolating himself and just feeling sorry for himself, he wanted to do something to benefit others. So for all of us during this time, we can do incredible things if we really are searching, what can I do for the sake of others? So what are the causes of loneliness? Well, the thing is, if we were all perfect, or we were living in the kingdom of heaven, and we were filled with God's love and we were in harmony, we wouldn't feel lonely. But because of our fallen state and separation from God, then our human condition is such that we live in a state of ignorance. And I'm not just talking about myself personally, but humankind, because of the fall, we became ignorant of our true purpose and who we are and who God is. And secondly, because of our ignorance, we also felt separated from God. So this separation from God, I suppose we would say, was because of sin, because we don't feel value, we don't feel good enough, we feel distant from God. There's this kind of gap between us because we are fallen nature. Then God is perfect and we are separated. And so this separation from God also causes us to feel separated from each other, because we can see each other as different, or as a threat, or as we live in this competitive world, or the world is full of all kinds of conflicts and divisions, and so because we feel separated from God and from our true identity, then we can feel separated from each other. But actually, our true identity is we have God's Spirit within us. we have a spark of divinity. That's our true nature, but we're not aware of it because of the way we think. And we don't feel good enough. We don't feel that we're close to God. Then our perception of who we are, of being separated from God, is false. It's an illusion of our limited mind. We need to expand our mind and realize who we truly are. But this, I think, creates a sense of loneliness because we feel isolated. We don't feel value. So if we are living by ourselves in a room by ourselves, and we don't know anything about God, but we feel some kind of separation. But if we realize that actually God is dwelling within us and God loves us and we have great value, and that we look at other people and we see, well, all people are God's children, all people have God's energy and spirit in them, then we can feel connected because we're all brothers and sisters. So there is no separation. And then we have inner conflict. We have our two natures. We have an original nature coming from God and our fallen nature. Our desire to live for the sake of others and this self-centered aspect. And so what causes loneliness? Well, if we're too much focused on ourselves, just think about ourselves, it's easy to feel disconnected from others. And but if we overcome our fallen nature, we overcome this self-centered quality within us, and we learn to develop a heart of love and kindness and compassion, and really reach out to others, we'll never feel lonely. So loneliness, it comes from this separation from God, from our ignorance. So what is our true purpose? Well, what is our purpose? So the world's religions actually tell us what our purpose is. That's why God inspired people to find purpose and to find meaning. And all those religions are about God and about understanding God's purpose for our life. And, Father, he commissioned this book, World Scripture, a comparative anthology of sacred texts. And he said that, if I remember rightly, around about 75% of what is contained in the different religions is the same. It's all basically the same because it's coming from the same source. So, that we should learn to live for others. So we're one family under God. This golden rule: do to others as you want those what you would like them to do to you. So, and actually most of our work is to do with interfaith, bringing all people together as one family. Yeah, we are connected to God, and God gave us this life so that we can grow closer to him. And so, of course, the divine principle is a new understanding, which actually can bring all these religions together and give clearer explanation about what our purpose is. So what is our purpose? Well, we talk about the three great blessings. And so the first blessing, to be fruitful, that this is a kind of the diagram we normally look at, that God is a subject, that our mind and body are subject and object. And when they're united, centered upon God and God's love and God's truth, then our true self, an ideal person, is a partner of love to God. So God dwells in the individual whose mind and body unite in a life of love for God and others. And if I read directly from the principle, it says this: the key to God's first blessing is the perfection of individual character. In order for an individual to perfect his character, he must form a four-position foundation within himself, whereby his mind and body become one through give and take action with God as their center. So if you become a person like this, who's really fully mature, where you feel God's presence, God's love, and your mind and body are uniting, then your mind will guide your body so that your body does good deeds and that your mind is filled with love and with hope and with joy. And so that's our purpose, to feel joy. So how can we be lonely if we are fulfilling the first blessing, or we are maturing ourselves as a character? Because we wouldn't feel alone, because we would feel God is with us. So even if you're in a room by yourself, or living in a prison by yourself, or on a remote island by yourself, if you feel God is with you, you cannot feel lonely. And what about the second blessing, to multiply, to multiply? It says in the principle, God's second blessing was to be fulfilled by Adam and Eve after they had achieved individual perfection as object partners to God, each manifesting an aspect of God's dual characteristics. In order to construct the four-position foundation in their family, Adam and Eve should have joined in loving oneness as husband and wife and raised children. This would have been the fulfillment of the second blessing. And from that family, it grows to a society, a nation, and the whole world. And it says here that God dwells in the family where husband and wife live for God, each other and their children, and where the family lives for the society, nation, and world. So once again, if we feel we are one family under God, if we feel that, of course, if we have a family where we can express love, then we cannot feel lonely. Of course, you might say, well, if I don't have a family, well, then maybe I feel lonely. Of course, God's desire is that we have a family. We come from a family. And in our fallen world, unfortunately, there are many broken families and so on. But if we consider that all people are part of the human family, so even if we don't have our own family, then all people are our brothers and sisters. All older people are like my parents. All younger people are like my children. Because Father, he said that before, that, is that, of course, within the family, we learn these relationships. But actually, every person in society out there is a bit like our brother or sister, our mother or father, our husband or wife. So if we have this expanded view of people, rather than seeing that people are separate and then I feel lost in a crowd and so on. But actually, if we see through God's eyes that God's spirit dwells in each person and God loves each person, and then we wouldn't feel separate. We would actually feel drawn to people because we would feel a connection in heart. And what about the third blessing, to take dominion over the creation? The principle says the meaning of God's third blessing is the perfection of human beings' dominion over the natural world. To fulfill this blessing, the four-position foundation of dominion must be established, centered on God. Human beings and the natural world must share love and beauty to become completely one. So, of course, this is where creativity comes. Being in nature, you can feel God's love. You can walk in nature and you not feel alone because it's so soothing and so uplifting. But also, the physical world is an environment that God has allowed us to use our creativity. So, all the things that have been invented and is through the creativity of people. And that gives joy. And so, sometimes people are alone being creative, but they don't feel lonely. And if you're a writer, you need peace and quiet to be by yourself. But being creative is sometimes a time where you want to be alone, but you don't feel lonely because you are creating something. Okay, so if we know what our purpose is, then we cannot be lonely. So if we look at the first blessing, this is more internal and within ourselves, finding harmony with ourselves, peace within ourselves, love within ourselves, God within ourselves. Whereas the other two blessings are more external, relating to others, relating to creation. And we need both. We need a balance. So we need to find a balance in life between the internal life, where we can be quiet and alone and at peace, and maybe we're out in nature, but we need to find this inner peace. But also, we're not created just to live by ourselves, but we're created to relate to others. And this is the external. So we need a balance of both. So it's all to do with our inner state of mind. And it's our perception of reality. And of course, if we understand what life's about, that changes everything. If we understand, then we will not feel separate from God. And if we understand, we will not have this struggle within ourselves, because we will understand that we're here to live for the sake of others, and we will overcome our self-centeredness. So Douglas Abrahams in his book, he says this, he says, "It has often amazed me that one day I can walk down the street feeling judgmental and critical of others, and I will feel separate and lonely." So it's actually our attitude. If we look down upon others, criticize others, we feel separate. So actually, that makes us feel lonely. And the next day, I can walk down the same street with more open-hearted acceptance and compassion, and suddenly everyone seems warm and friendly. So loneliness is very much dependent upon how we perceive other people, what our internal attitude is. It is almost as if my inner state of mind and heart changes the physical and social world around me completely. So during this pandemic, whatever the challenges are, if we can maintain the right inner state of mind, then we don't need to feel lonely. And we can see people as suddenly warm and friendly. So let me return to the 4 questions I began with. Do you like to be alone? Actually, I have to say, yes, I like to be alone. Having been a busy teacher and a busy parent for so many years, I really appreciate the time alone, and I think I need it. On the other hand, if I'm alone too long, I start to miss, my wife and my children and visitors. So I think to be alone is very beneficial, and we can use it well. We use it to tune in, to be at peace, and to whether we study God's word or we pray or meditate is actually a very good opportunity. What causes loneliness? Well, I talked about how this kind of, if we don't really understand our purpose, if our purpose is in only our job, but we don't actually find like a purpose within ourselves, and we don't know what life is all about, then it's easy to feel isolated and not at peace within. So I think what I talked about before, because of this separation from God and because of our ignorance, then loneliness can grow. And what can we do to overcome loneliness? Well, I just explained the principle, and maybe we have read about the 3 blessings over and over again, and maybe we feel, well, I've heard it all before, but actually it's really important that we keep studying and keep reminding ourselves about what our priorities are, because it's so easy to kind of drift off. And that's why, maintaining spiritual practices of prayer, meditation, study is essential, so that whatever challenges come in our life, and including loneliness, that we can overcome them. And finally, has your life changed much during the pandemic? I would say, for me, of course, before I retired, I was still working. And but our school kept open most of the time. It didn't affect us so much. Now I'm retired, so I don't need to go out so much. But of course, when I go shopping, I'm a lot more conscious and more careful of not getting close to people. I suppose also visiting people or being visited has restricted this. But it has only changed my life a little. For some, it has changed it enormously because of the death of a loved one, or people have become, struggle because they've lost their job and they then feel more isolated. But I wonder, when I finish this, these maybe are good questions for discussion. How much has the pandemic affected you? Have you felt more lonely? Do you like being alone? And how do you think, what would you do to help others if they're feeling lonely, how to overcome their loneliness, or how would you advise yourself? So with those final questions, thank you for listening. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.